Good morning, Karoo. It is Monday, the 9th of September, and quick update on what's going on in my life, and maybe a bit of a rant that I'm going to give you. So, to begin with, I think I told you previously that we kind of looked at maybe trading in our camper van for a new one because saw something that looked interesting to us. In the end, we decided that the amount they wanted for it didn't make sense for us, so I decided to go ahead and do some work to fix up our camper van. So I made a list of 11 things to do on the camper van. I've done a few of them, so I thought I'd just quickly give you a run through. And the first is this back area here where I cut a hole for extra storage, and I just put this cheap rubberized trim around it, which was something I'd been intending to do for some time and just hadn't gotten around to, so I went ahead and did that. In addition, inside here, a number of these things are just things I've cleaned up, but the inside area here, all of this white is stuff I've added. It's a vinyl contact paper, and it lightens things up. And the dinette here that you see, or not dinette, sorry, the galley. I had on this side over here, this cabinet I'd done a long time ago. These 3 drawers over here, the latches on the top 2 of them had both quit working, so I bought replacement latches, and while I was replacing them I figured I'd put the white contact paper on there and clean those up as well, and I'm really happy with the way it came out. It probably took 10 hours to get that right, but it worked. I also actually am putting the white contact paper down here. There's some damage here that I want to repair or cover up, and I'll put that over it. I already put some white in that space over there, and that's my piece of contact paper underneath that that I'm going to use. And then up here, this little storage space, which I know looks like a complete mess, that's where there was a radio in there when we got the rig. There was a television over here, and basically I've turned that all into storage space. And the liner of that cabinet area is something I made, and it had always flopped down, and I basically fixed it so it stayed up. So that's a few little things that I did, which are not earth-shaking, but I figured you're not doing jobs on the money pit at the moment. I might as well give you a little home improvement, even if it's an RV improvement. So spent several days on that. I've got more stuff on the list actually to do, some of which is going to be a little more work than other things. I need to get the windshield replaced. I need to get the tires rotated, that kind of stuff. That's all fairly easy, boring stuff I'm not going to talk about. But yeah, I'm happy to be getting things a little fixed up. Nice, just little stuff makes me feel good. The second thing I want to talk about today is, like I said, a bit of a rant. Yesterday, I was listening to podcasts while I was working on this, and I listened to a couple podcasts together that set me off on something last night that I was just really kind of annoyed at and ranting at Sarah about. And that is the discussion of experts in our society. And what I've seen a few times recently, people talking about how dismissing the idea that we need to assess the information we get for ourselves and decide what we think is right and make our decisions based on that, because we should be relying on experts, because it diminishes the experts if you do that. And I actually, one of the podcasts I listened to was a guy critiquing. So the previous, or the early CEO of Google is now a multi-billionaire. And somebody did a podcast where this guy actually did a talk at Stanford to a bunch of people who want to become tech bros, essentially. People who want to work in Silicon Valley, be the new innovators, as they call themselves. And the podcast actually said, this is what oligarchs really think. That was how it was titled. And so this guy was, and he said a bunch of things that were just a little bit disturbing. Like, for instance, he recommended to them that, they get an AI to go out and like scrape all of TikTok's code and user base, and then have AI just improve it and then market that. And don't worry about the fact you're stealing intellectual property. Let your lawyers sort it out later. That sort of thing. So obvious, stuff like that really bother, is kind of what you expect from an oligarch, I guess, or in business, business ethics now don't say you shouldn't steal stuff from other people. It's like you just take it and then you let the lawyers sort it out. But the other thing he said actually was that misinformation is a major is what he considers like the biggest threat to our democracy. But when they asked him what we should do about it, he said we need to teach people critical thinking. And it's interesting because the guy who was critiquing the talk was just irate about that, and he said, you are, if you're just going to dismiss that and say you need to teach critical thinking rather than protect people from misinformation, that's such an entitled point of view. And I honestly have kind of a problem with protecting people from misinformation. Because obviously if you, I think it's a little ironic, because I think the left and the right both accuse the other side of being dictators, wanting a dictatorship. And the left accuses the right of wanting to allow an oligarchy, right? So money dictates, policies and makes everything. And the right accuses the left of wanting the government to take that role. And this was an example of that, where, this guy critiquing the idea that we need to learn critical thinking skills is thinking that the government should actually step in and protect people from bad information. And of course, the problem with that is that somebody has to make that decision about what information we need to be protected from. And that leads me to the thing that I went on a rant about to Sarah last night. And I was I've gone down a rabbit hole, reading up on Israel and the Israel Gaza conflict, and I watched it was essentially a podcast, but it was a video. I kind of had it on in the background, where a guy had a 22-minute thing where he was like he was going to talk about the reported number of deaths in Gaza. And he said, and he started out by saying this is a incredibly contentious thing. There's a lot of misinformation out there. So I want to tell you what studies are out there, what academics have said about this. And then he goes on to explain how the Hamas governmental health authority reports numbers and what the ambiguities are in that. And I've actually read, I read a study a couple months ago by some statisticians who looked into these numbers and talked about these specific problems, and then talked about, they ran statistical tests on the internal consistency of the numbers and found huge problems with them. Not surprisingly. I mean, there's a war going on. But the guy in this podcast didn't reference that. He talked about some of those problems. The first half of his video was really about how the health authority collects those numbers and what the problems are with that. But then the majority of his video dealt with this one. Actually, it was a letter published in Lancet. And I don't know if you're familiar with Lancet. It's a medical journal where these three guys said the number of deaths. So the reported number of deaths in Gaza are a little over 40,000 now, which is horrific as it is. But they claimed that the actual number of deaths are closer to 186,000 in this letter. Now, the guy in the video did point out that this was not a peer-reviewed publication, although at the beginning of the video he talked about this as if it were a study, right? It's not a study. And then he explained the way that they came to this number. And there's no empirical work has been done. All they did was look at direct and indirect deaths in other conflicts where people report direct deaths, and then the total number of deaths and what those proportions are. And they estimated that the indirect deaths would be 4.5 times the number of direct deaths based on these other conflicts. And therefore, the number should be 186,000. And of course, they found some people from the UN who said, we think this may be correct, blah, 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 or people from an NGO, who are advocates. Now, the problem with that, and having read this other statistical treatment of the death counts, is that the health authority numbers that are reported are all deaths in Gaza during this period. They're not direct deaths. They're a combination of direct and indirect deaths. And they say that, in the reporting. I mean, that's broadly known. And the guy doing this video basically was like, we need to listen to these experts who wrote an article, a letter to Lancet, where, who clearly have, they're concerned about how bad things are in Gaza. And they wrote this letter that Lancet published, nobody catching the fact that the very premise of their estimates is flawed, because the number 40,000 or just over 40,000 should be direct and indirect deaths. It's all deaths. The health authority reports that. And so the idea that there are another, 145,000 people dead in Gaza that are unaccounted for, it should have raised red flags from the start. It's like, if you can't hide 145,000 other deaths. There are NGOs there. There are people there on the ground. It doesn't make any sense, like, from the very start. And yet, Lancet published this. This has been widely reported in the press. There's been discussion about it. There's been critique of it. But this guy does, who I've listened to a lot of his blogs. He tends to do conflict-related videos about, and he's very authoritative and thoughtful. He's got 1 million subscribers, and he's reporting this, and it's total bullshit. And these are experts who are actually publishing this. And the problem is with the role of the expert. I know I've gone on a long time here, and in our society, this argument that you need to listen to experts because you're not an expert. The role of an expert is not to tell you what to do or tell you what the truth is. The role of an expert should be to explain the processes through which the conclusions that they reach have been reached, so that you can judge the quality of those conclusions. And in this case, the fact that, and there's other examples of this. I mean, I know, Anthony Fauci has been unfairly persecuted by the right, but at the same time, when he says something like, if you argue with me, you're arguing with the science, that is not, Anthony Fauci is an expert, but what he's doing is he's glossing over the actual critical thinking process that you should be following to make sense of the information you get. And he's just saying, just take my word for it. And this is what religion has done for years. And it's crazy because, like, John McWhorter in his recent book talked about how, the recent strategies for dealing with racism in our country he says, are a religion. And what he means is they're an appeal to authority, and if you question them at all, you're seen as part of the problem rather than part of the solution. And he sees that as a religion. And in the same way, this idea that we need to take the expert's word for it is a very, it harkens back to fundamentalist religious approaches, where you just take something as given because somebody knows more than you and they're going to tell you. I just think that's so misguided. It bothers me so much because, there are people who I tend to listen to, but at the same time, sometimes they say things and I think you're wrong about that. And I think you're wrong about that for these reasons. I don't just take their word for it. And you can't just take the word of somebody who publishes something in Lancet because they're an expert. Actually, the guy from the University of London whose model of COVID deaths was the driver. It was the thing that everyone was talking about. I forget his name now. Scottish name. Anyway, and I heard an interview with the chief epidemiologist from Sweden, and they asked him why he was so skeptical. Neil Ferguson was the name of Neil Ferguson's model, and he said, I've published papers with Neil Ferguson, I know his approach, and I think there's serious flaws in it. That is important. You can't just, and you've got to recognize that these are two academics who are, who have real substantive differences of opinion, and one of them has to be right or more right than the other. Actually, the same thing, like when Sarah went to get her bunion surgery, and she went to a first doctor, and he recommended a very specific procedure, and she was going to go do it, and I said, and it was incredibly invasive. They were going to rebuild her whole foot. And I said, let's get a second opinion. This is going to be huge. We went and talked to the second doctor, and he had a completely different opinion. These are two experts, had a completely different opinion. And the second doctor said, these are the names of these two procedures. Go online, look it up, and read about them, and make your decision. That's what an expert should do. An expert should arm you with the ability to make a more informed decision. They shouldn't tell you what's right and wrong. And, Sarah and I went and looked up these two different techniques and found that the one the second guy was offering seemed to make more sense. And there's all kinds of documentation online of people who having the first guy's recommended surgery and it not working and having to go back and do the second one. And, I don't know. This has gone on way too long. But, the idea that we should not think for ourselves and that the government, or not the government, anybody, any organization needs to protect us from misinformation, the only way to solve the problems we face is we have to take responsibility. And it doesn't mean you have to know everything, but there are really simple ways to discount many, many of these types of misinformation that most people are capable of. Anyway, 20-minute video, sorry about that. That's my story, I'm sticking to it. Sorry you had to sit through this, but obviously I'm a little worked up.